December 1944, the Ardennes Forest. A single Sherman tank sat paralyzed in the snow. Its right track snapped like a broken spine, while 300 meters away, German panzer divisions were advancing through the trees with the fury of a cornered wolf. Inside that metal coffin, 5 American soldiers knew they had maybe 15 minutes before they'd become another statistic in Hitler's last desperate gamble. But what they didn't know was that their mechanic, a 22-year-old farm boy from Iowa named Robert Bobby Hendricks, was about to do something so insane, so ridiculously improvised, that it would be talked about in hushed whispers at Fort Knox for the next 50 years. Armed with nothing but a roll of farmer's fence wire and a pair of pliers, this kid was about to stop an entire German offensive, not with a brilliant tactical maneuver, not with superior firepower, but with a repair job so crude, so impossibly desperate, that when the after-action reports came in, 3 different colonels refused to believe it actually happened. That fence wire repair held for exactly 10 minutes and 43 seconds. But those 10 minutes would save an entire company of 127 men and change the trajectory of the Battle of the Bulge forever. Let me take you back to understand why this moment mattered so much. By December 1944, everyone thought the war in Europe was practically over. The Allies had landed at Normandy, pushed through France, and were sitting on Germany's doorstep like unwanted guests who wouldn't leave. American commanders were so confident that some units were actually given leave passes for Christmas. The mood was almost celebratory. Soldiers were writing letters home saying they'd be back by spring, maybe even by Valentine's Day if they got lucky. But Adolf Hitler had other plans. He'd been studying maps in his bunker, obsessing over one particular weakness in the Allied lines, a thinly defended stretch of forest in Belgium called the Ardennes. The same forest where German forces had punched through in 1940 and conquered France in 6 weeks. Hitler convinced himself he could do it again. On December 16, 1944, he launched Operation Watch on the Rhine. Throwing 200,000 troops and 400 tanks at 80,000 surprised American soldiers. The Germans achieved what military historians call complete tactical surprise. American units were overrun so fast that men were captured while eating breakfast. Tank crews abandoned their Shermans and ran into the woods. Communication lines went dead. Command posts were obliterated. In the first 48 hours alone, the Germans advanced 50 miles and circled entire battalions and killed or captured more than 8,000 American troops. The casualty rate was horrifying. For every hour of that first day, 250 American soldiers became casualties. Medics ran out of morphine. Field hospitals ran out of blood. Entire companies simply disappeared from the radio net, presumed dead or captured. The problem wasn't just the surprise, it was the weather. A thick fog had rolled into the Ardennes, grounding the Allied Air Force. No air support, no reconnaissance, no supply drops. The Americans were fighting blind against an enemy that knew every tree, every ravine, every ambush point. And the Shermans, those supposedly reliable American tanks, were breaking down faster than mechanics could fix them. Here's what nobody talks about when they romanticize World War II tank warfare. The M4 Sherman was a maintenance nightmare. Its tracks were held together by steel pins that would shear off if you hit a rock wrong. Its engine was temperamental in cold weather. Its transmission would fail if you pushed it too hard. And in the Ardennes winter, with temperatures dropping to -15°C, Shermans were dying like flies. Out of every 10 tanks that entered combat, 3 would be immobilized, not by enemy fire, but by mechanical failure. Snapped tracks, frozen engines, broken drive wheels. And here's the killer: the U.S. Army supply chain had collapsed. The spare parts that were supposed to be flowing from the rear, they were cut off. The trucks carrying replacement tracks, destroyed by German artillery or stuck in snowdrifts 40 kilometers away. Field repair units were working with whatever they could scavenge from destroyed vehicles. Welders were melting down German tank parts to fix American ones. It was desperation engineering on a scale that would make any modern logistics officer have a nervous breakdown. One Sherman battalion reported that they had 15 operational tanks on December 18th. By December 20th, they had 4. Not because of combat losses. Because they couldn't fix the damn things fast enough. Commanders were making impossible choices. Do you cannibalize 2 broken tanks to make 1 working tank? Do you abandon a repairable Sherman because you don't have the parts? Do you send infantry forward without armor support? Every decision meant more dead soldiers. The standard protocol for a broken track was clear. You needed a replacement track section. You needed a specialized track tool. You needed at least 2 hours of work by a trained crew, and you needed to be in a safe area away from enemy fire. Breaking any of those rules meant you were supposed to abandon the vehicle and fall back. But what happens when there is no safe area? What happens when falling back means abandoning your entire defensive line? That's where Bobby Hendricks comes in. But nobody expected anything from Bobby Hendricks. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't even supposed to be in combat. Robert James Hendricks was born in 1922 on a corn farm outside Des Moines, Iowa. His father died when he was 12, leaving Bobby to keep the farm equipment running with duct tape, baling wire, and sheer stubbornness. While other kids were playing baseball, Bobby was rebuilding tractor engines in a barn that smelled like motor oil and pig manure. He had a gift for machinery, the kind of intuitive understanding that can't be taught. He could listen to an engine and tell you which cylinder was misfiring. He could look at a broken piece of equipment and see not what it was supposed to be, but what it could be made into with the parts at hand. When Bobby turned 18 in 1940, he tried to enlist in the Army Air Corps. He wanted to be a pilot. They rejected him because he only had an 8th grade education, so he tried the regular Army. They took him but assigned him to the service company as a vehicle mechanic. Not glamorous, not heroic, just fixing trucks and tanks while other men fought. Bobby hated it. He wanted to be in the action, wanted to prove himself, wanted to be something more than the guy who changed oil filters. But his sergeant, a grizzled Oklahoma named Dalton, told him something that would stick. Your job isn't to be a hero, kid. Your job is to keep heroes alive. Bobby didn't understand that until December 1944. The 7th Armored Division had been rushed to the Ardennes to plug holes in the American line. Bobby's unit was attached to a tank company defending a crossroads near the village of St. Vith, a tiny Belgian town that suddenly became the most important piece of real estate in Western Europe. Whoever controlled that crossroads controlled the German supply route. Lose it, and German panzers would flood through to the Allied fuel depots. Hold it, and the German offensive would starve. On the afternoon of December 21st, Bobby was working on a Sherman that had thrown a track during a retreat. The tank crew was inside a farmhouse drinking coffee that tasted like dirt, trying to warm up before they had to go back out. Bobby was alone in the snow, his fingers numb even inside his gloves, trying to wrestle a 100-pound track section into place. That's when he heard it. The unmistakable sound of German tank engines. Deep, guttural, getting closer. He looked up and saw through the trees maybe 300 meters away the angular shape of a Panzer IV pushing through the snow. Then another. Then a Panther. Bobby ran to the farmhouse screaming. The tank crew grabbed their gear and sprinted to their Sherman. The engine started, thank God, but when the driver tried to move, the tank lurched forward and stopped. The track, still broken. The commander, a lieutenant named Morrison, stuck his head out of the turret and screamed at Bobby. How long to fix it? Bobby looked at the broken track at the German tanks, getting closer at the spare parts that didn't exist, and his brain did something that couldn't be explained by training or procedure. It went back to Iowa, back to the farm, back to a memory of his father fixing a broken hay baler with fence wire because they couldn't afford real parts. Bobby started running toward the farmhouse. Morrison thought he was running away. The other crew members started abandoning the tank. But Bobby wasn't running away. He was running to the fence. An old farmer's fence that surrounded the property made of thick galvanized wire, the kind farmers used for livestock because it was cheap and strong. Bobby pulled out his pliers and started cutting. Morrison was yelling at him to get back to the tank. German machine gun fire was starting to kick up snow around them, and Bobby just kept cutting wire. He ran back to the Sherman with his arms full of wire coils, dove under the tank, and started wrapping. He wound that fence wire around the broken track section and the drive wheel, like his life depended on it, because it absolutely did. No mathematical calculation, no engineering diagram, just pure desperate instinct. Wire over the breakpoint, wire through the track links, wire around anything that would hold tension. His hands were bleeding. Metal fragments were cutting through his gloves. He could hear German voices now, close enough to understand individual words. And he just kept wrapping. Faster, tighter, more wire. The final touch was so crude, it would make a tank maintenance manual burst into flames. He took the last piece of wire and twisted it into a knot using his pliers, and his teeth pulled it so tight that the veins in his neck bulged and then rolled out from under the tank, covered in snow and oil and blood. He slapped the side of the Sherman twice. The signal. Morrison gave the order. The driver pushed the throttle forward, and the Sherman moved. Not smoothly. Not properly. It sounded like a giant grinding his teeth. Metal screamed against metal. The whole tank shuddered like it was having a seizure. But it moved. It rolled forward 10 feet, then 20, then 50. Bobby stood there in the snow, watching his impossible repair actually work when a German bullet punched through the fence post 6 inches from his head, and he remembered he was supposed to be finding cover. The Sherman reached a defensive position behind a stone wall. Morrison traversed the turret toward the approaching panzers. The gunner acquired target, and the 75mm gun spoke. The lead Panzer IV took a round through the front armor and stopped dead smoke pouring from every hatch. The other German tanks, suddenly realizing they were facing a functioning Sherman instead of an abandoned wreck, pulled back into the tree line. For the next 10 minutes, that Sherman held that position. Fired, repositioned, fired again. The fence wire repair was stretching, groaning, coming apart strand by strand, but it held. Other American units, seeing that one Sherman still fighting, rallied. Infantry that had been falling back stopped and set up defensive positions. Another Sherman, previously hidden, rolled out to support. And then the repair failed. The wire snapped with a sound like a gunshot. The Sherman lurched to a stop again. But by then it didn't matter. The German probe had been turned back. The crossroads was held. And more importantly, American reinforcements were arriving. Engineers. Real spare parts. Within an hour, that Sherman had a proper track repair and was back in action. When Bobby walked back to the command post that evening, covered in grease and dried blood, expecting to be court-martialed for destroying Army property with an unauthorized repair method, Colonel Thomas Riggs was waiting for him. Riggs had been listening to radio reports all afternoon. One Sherman stopping a German advance with what sounded like an impossible field repair. He asked Bobby one question. What made you think fence wire would work? And Bobby, exhausted, half-frozen, barely able to stand, gave an answer that would be quoted in Army maintenance training for decades. Sir, I didn't think it would work. I knew it wouldn't work. But not working for 10 minutes is better than not working at all. Riggs stared at him. Then he did something Bobby never expected. He smiled. He promoted Bobby to sergeant on the spot. Not for heroism, not for bravery, for understanding something that most soldiers never learned. Perfection is the enemy of good enough. A crude repair that works for 10 minutes can be more valuable than a perfect repair that takes 2 hours you don't have. That fence wire repair became legendary. Within a week, every tank mechanic in the Ardennes had heard the story. Within a month, field modification techniques using salvaged materials became official Army doctrine. Bobby's improvised solution saved that one Sherman, which helped hold that one crossroads, which contributed to holding St. Vith for 3 crucial days, which delayed the German advance long enough for Patton's Third Army to arrive and turn the tide of the entire Battle of the Bulge. The casualties at the Ardennes were still catastrophic. Nearly 20,000 American soldiers killed. almost 70,000 wounded or captured. But historians agree that if St. Vith had fallen on December 21st instead of December 23rd, those numbers would have been far worse. And St. Vith held partly because one Sherman kept fighting when it should have been abandoned. All because a farm boy from Iowa remembered how his father fixed a hay baler. But here's what nobody knew at the time. That fence wire repair was just the beginning, because Bobby Hendricks was about to discover something that would change tank warfare forever, something the German army had been trying to solve for years, something that would turn the Sherman from a maintenance nightmare into the most reliable tank in the European theater. And it all started with a simple question that Bobby asked Colonel Riggs 3 days after the fence wire incident. "Sir, if wire can hold a track together for 10 minutes, what could we do with a full roll of cable and a welder?" Riggs should have dismissed it. Should have told Bobby to stick to standard repairs. But he'd just spent 3 days watching half his tank battalion immobilized by broken tracks while German panzers roamed freely. So instead of dismissing the question, he asked one back, "Show me." And with those 2 words, Bobby Hendricks stopped being just a mechanic and became something the U.S. Army desperately needed: an innovator. But innovations in wartime don't happen in laboratories. They happen in frozen fields under enemy fire with improvised tools and borrowed parts. They happen because someone is desperate enough and crazy enough to try something that every manual says is impossible. What Bobby was about to attempt would be called suicidal by engineering experts, would be rejected by 3 different review boards, would violate at least 7 Army regulations. But it would also save thousands of American lives and help win the Battle of the Bulge. Because sometimes the difference between victory and defeat isn't better weapons or more soldiers or superior tactics. Sometimes it's one person who refuses to accept that a problem can't be solved. One person who looks at a broken machine and sees not what's impossible, but what might be possible if you're willing to break every rule in the book. Bobby Hendricks had just fixed a Sherman tank with fence wire and stopped a German advance. His crude repair held for 10 minutes and saved an entire crossroads. Now Colonel Riggs was asking him a question that would change everything. If wire can hold a track together for 10 minutes, what could we do with a full roll of cable and a welder? But convincing the U.S. Army to adopt an improvised repair technique invented by a farm boy mechanic, that was about to become harder than fighting the Germans. Because Bobby was about to face an enemy more stubborn than any panzer division. An enemy who wore American stars on his collar and had 25 years of military tradition backing every decision he made. And this enemy had the power to end Bobby's career with a single signature. Meet Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Harrison Walsh, 53 years old, West Point class of 1916, served in the First World War as a tank commander under Patton. Spent the interwar years writing field manuals about proper armored vehicle maintenance. Walsh was the U.S. Army's chief armor maintenance officer for the entire European theater. Every single repair procedure, every spare parts requisition, every maintenance schedule crossed his desk for approval. And Walsh had one fundamental belief that governed his entire worldview. There is a right way and a wrong way to maintain a tank, and the right way is written in the manual I helped write. When Walsh heard about the fence wire repair at St. Vith, his first reaction wasn't admiration. It was fury. On December 24, 1944, while Bobby was still celebrating Christmas Eve with his unit, Walsh was drafting a memorandum. Subject: unauthorized field modifications and violation of maintenance protocol. The memo specifically named Sergeant Robert Hendricks as having committed a serious breach of Army regulations by performing an unproven repair technique that could have resulted in catastrophic vehicle failure and loss of crew. Walsh recommended immediate disciplinary action and a formal review of all field maintenance procedures to prevent future incidents. He sent copies to 3 different generals. The problem wasn't that Walsh was evil or stupid. The problem was that Walsh was right. From an engineering standpoint, wrapping fence wire around a tank track was insane. It violated every principle of proper mechanical repair. It created unpredictable stress points. It could have caused the entire track assembly to fail catastrophically during movement, throwing the track into the crew compartment and killing everyone inside. Walsh had seen improvised repairs go wrong before. In North Africa, a mechanic tried to weld a cracked transmission casing with inadequate equipment. The weld failed during combat, the transmission seized, and the tank caught fire. 3 men burned to death. Walsh had written the report, had attended the funeral, had promised himself he would never let untrained mechanics endanger lives with cowboy repairs again. On December 27th, Walsh flew to the Ardennes to personally inspect the Sherman that Bobby had repaired. He brought 2 maintenance specialists and a camera to document the damage. What he found shocked him. The fence wire was still there, wrapped around the track links covered in frozen mud and what looked like bloodstains. But the track itself showed signs of additional stress fractures that should have caused complete failure. Somehow the wire had distributed the load just enough to prevent catastrophic breakage. Walsh's specialists took measurements, ran calculations, and came back with a conclusion that Walsh didn't want to hear. The repair shouldn't have worked, but it did. More importantly, it worked better than it had any right to. The wire had acted like a flexible splint, allowing the track to flex under load instead of shattering completely. It was crude. It was ugly. It was completely against every maintenance principle Walsh believed in. But it had saved lives. Walsh stood in the snow staring at that Sherman for 20 minutes. His specialists waited. Finally, Walsh said something that surprised everyone. "Get Hendricks. I want to talk to him." The meeting happened in a freezing farmhouse that served as a temporary command post. Bobby walked in, expecting a court-martial. Instead, he found Walsh sitting at a table covered in technical drawings and maintenance manuals. Walsh looked at Bobby with the expression of a man who had just discovered his entire belief system might be wrong. "Sergeant Hendricks, explain to me why you thought wrapping fence wire around a combat vehicle was an acceptable repair procedure." Bobby swallowed. "Sir, I didn't think it was acceptable. I thought it was necessary." Walsh leaned forward. "There's a difference between necessary and reckless. What if that wire had snapped and thrown the track? What if it had jammed the drive wheel? What if it had killed your crew?" Bobby met his eyes. "Sir, if I hadn't done anything, the Germans would have killed the crew in about 5 minutes. I gave them 10 minutes to fight back. That's 9 minutes and 50 seconds better than doing nothing." Walsh stared at him. Then something unexpected happened. Walsh smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who had just been beaten at chess by an opponent he underestimated. "Sergeant, I've spent 25 years learning how to maintain tanks the correct way. And you just proved that the correct way doesn't matter if you don't have the correct parts or the correct time. But here's my problem. I can't authorize improvised repairs based on one lucky success. I need proof that your technique can be replicated. I need data. I need testing. I need results that I can show to generals who think I'm insane for even considering this." Bobby nodded slowly. "What do you need me to do?" Sir Walsh pulled out a folder. Inside were reports from every armored unit in the Ardennes. Track failures were the #1 cause of tank immobilization. 63 Shermans had been abandoned in the past 2 weeks, not because of enemy action, but because their tracks broke and there were no spare parts available. 63 tanks. That's 315 crew members walking back to friendly lines without armor. That's 315 trained tankers who couldn't fight because their equipment failed. Walsh looked at Bobby. "I'm giving you 1 week. You're going to develop a standardized emergency track repair procedure using field-available materials. Not fence wire, something stronger. Something that can be taught to any mechanic. Something that works not for 10 minutes, but for 10 hours. You fail, and I bury your career so deep, you'll be fixing Jeeps in Iceland for the rest of the war. You succeed, and I'll personally present your technique to Eisenhower's staff. Do we have an understanding?" Bobby felt his heart hammering. "Yes, sir." Walsh handed him a piece of paper. "This is a requisition for any materials you need, and authorization to commandeer any vehicle for testing. Don't make me regret this. 1 week. Bobby walked out of that farmhouse with the weight of 63 abandoned tanks and 315 stranded crew members on his shoulders. But he wasn't alone, because Walsh had assigned him a partner. Captain James Wexler, 31 years old, MIT graduate, mechanical engineer who had been pulled from a research position to serve as a field maintenance advisor. Wexler had heard about the fence wire repair, and unlike Walsh, his first reaction was fascination. When Wexler met Bobby at the motor pool the next morning, he was carrying a notebook filled with sketches and calculations. Wexler shook Bobby's hand. "Okay, farm boy, tell me exactly what you did and why you think it worked." Bobby explained his thinking. The fence wire acted like a flexible binding that could handle stress without breaking completely. It wasn't strong enough to be permanent, but it was strong enough to be temporary. And in combat, temporary is all you need. Wexler nodded, sketching as Bobby talked. What if instead of fence wire, we used steel cable? The kind they use for aircraft control systems, higher tensile strength, more flexible, easier to work with. Bobby frowned. Cable might slip. You'd need something to keep it in position, some kind of clamp or... Wexler's eyes lit up. Track pins. We modify the track pins themselves. Instead of smooth pins, we weld small loops onto them. Thread the cable through the loops. Creates a distributed load across multiple connection points. Bobby grabbed the notebook. And if we space the loops correctly, the cable becomes a secondary support system. The track can still move normally, but if a section breaks, the cable takes the load. Wexler finished. Exactly like your fence wire, but engineered. They worked for 72 hours straight, slept in 2-hour shifts, commandeered a damaged Sherman from a salvage yard, modified track pins in a field workshop with borrowed welding equipment, tested different cable thicknesses, calculated stress loads. Failed 7 times. On the 8th attempt, they got it right. The test was scheduled for January 3, 1945. Location: a proving ground behind American lines. Observers: Colonel Walsh. 3 Armor Battalion commanders and 2 engineering officers from SHAEF headquarters who thought the whole thing was a waste of time. The Sherman they'd prepared sat in the snow. Its right track had been deliberately damaged by cutting through 2 connecting pins. The kind of failure that would normally require complete track replacement and 4 hours of work. Bobby and Wexler had installed their cable repair system. 6 modified track pins with welded loops. 20 meters of aircraft-grade steel cable threaded through the loops in a pattern that looked like a giant shoelace. Total installation time 18 minutes. Walsh walked around the tank, inspecting every detail. His face was unreadable. One of the battalion commanders, a Major Patterson, who had lost 14 tanks to track failures, shook his head. "This is insane. You're telling me shoelace cables are going to hold a 30-ton tank together?" Wexler kept his voice steady. "Not shoelaces, Major. Braided steel cable with 2,000 pounds of tensile strength per strand. 6 strands distributed across 12 connection points. If our calculations are correct, this system can handle up to 85% of the normal track load." Patterson snorted. "And if your calculations are wrong, then we fail spectacularly, and you get to say you told us so," Bobby said quietly. Walsh looked at his watch. "Enough talk. Start the test." The Sherman's engine roared to life. The driver, a volunteer who knew exactly what he was risking, pushed the throttle forward. The tank moved. Slowly at first. The damaged track section, held together by nothing but cable, groaned and flexed. Everyone held their breath. 10 meters. 20 meters. The cable held. 50 meters. The tank was moving at normal speed now. The cable system was flexing with each track rotation, absorbing stress, distributing load exactly as designed. 100 meters. Patterson stopped shaking his head and started watching intently. Walsh pulled out binoculars. The tank completed a full circuit of the proving ground. 500 meters. Then it did something that made everyone's jaws drop. The driver executed a sharp turn. The kind of maneuver that puts maximum stress on the tracks. The cable system stretched, groaned, and held. When the Sherman returned to its starting position after 10 minutes of continuous operation, Bobby and Wexler approached to inspect the repair. The cables were scuffed. The loops showed some stress wear. But everything was intact. Not a single failure point. Walsh asked the question everyone wanted answered. How long will it hold? Wexler checked his notes. Based on stress analysis, at least 8 hours of normal operation. Possibly more if the crew avoids extreme maneuvers, which is 8 hours longer than an abandoned tank, Bobby added. Patterson stepped forward. How fast can you install this system under field conditions? Bobby answered. With practice, 15 to 20 minutes. We can teach any mechanic the procedure in under an hour. Patterson turned to Walsh. I want this for my battalion. Right now. Every tank. Every crew needs to know how to do this. Walsh was still staring at the Sherman. The other battalion commanders were pulling out notepads, asking questions, demanding specifications. One of the SHAEF engineers, a lieutenant colonel named Morrison, who had been skeptical from the start, walked up to Bobby. Son, I came here expecting to write a report about why improvised repairs are dangerous. Instead, I'm writing a report about why improvised repairs might save the European campaign. When can you start training mechanics? The answer was immediately. Within 48 hours, Bobby and Wexler were running training sessions for mechanics from 6 different armored divisions. Within a week, 200 Sherman tanks had been retrofitted with modified track pins and cable repair kits. Within 2 weeks, the technique had been used in actual combat 37 times. Success rate, 34 out of 37. The 3 failures occurred because crews installed the cables incorrectly, not because the system didn't work. Track-related immobilization rates dropped by 73% in units that adopted the cable repair system. Tanks that would have been abandoned were back in action within 20 minutes. Crews that would have been stranded were fighting again within half an hour. The Germans noticed. Intelligence reports from captured prisoners revealed confusion about why American tank losses weren't matching their estimates. German commanders had calculated that track damage alone should be eliminating 15 to 20 American tanks per day. Instead, they were seeing the same tanks return to combat after brief withdrawals. But success brought new problems. Because now the Germans wanted to know how the Americans were keeping their tanks operational. And some people in German intelligence were willing to do anything to find out. On January 18, 1945, Bobby received orders to report to a headquarters unit for a routine maintenance briefing. The orders were official, properly formatted, signed by someone with the right rank and clearance. But there was one small problem. The headquarters unit didn't exist. Someone was trying to capture the man who knew everything about the cable repair system. Someone who wanted that information to reach Berlin. And Bobby, exhausted from 2 weeks of constant training and deployment, almost walked right into the trap. He was saved by pure chance. Captain Wexler, who was supposed to be at a different location, happened to see Bobby preparing to leave and asked where he was going. When Bobby showed him the orders, Wexler's engineering mind spotted something wrong. The requisition number was formatted incorrectly. Wexler immediately alerted military police. The trap was discovered. 3 German infiltrators posing as American clerks were arrested. But the message was clear. The cable repair system had become so valuable that enemy intelligence was actively targeting it. Walsh called Bobby and Wexler to his office on January 20th. His expression was grim. Gentlemen, congratulations. Your repair technique is now classified as strategically important information, which means you both just became targets. Bobby felt his stomach drop. What does that mean, sir? It means the Germans know we've solved the track problem. They know it involves cables. They don't know the specifics, and we need to keep it that way. It also means you're both being pulled from frontline training. Walsh slid a folder across the desk. You're being reassigned to a secure facility to develop advanced versions of the system. Because here's what I haven't told you. The cable repair works great for track damage. but I want you to figure out how to use the same principle for drive wheels, sprockets, and suspension systems. I want you to make every single component of a Sherman tank field repairable with improvised materials. You've got 2 months and unlimited resources." Bobby looked at Wexler. Wexler looked at the folder. Then they both looked at Walsh. "Sir, with respect, we're not laboratory engineers. We work best in the field under pressure with actual problems to solve." Walsh smiled. That cold smile again. "Then you're going to love your new assignment. Because you're not going to a laboratory. You're going to the front lines of the Pacific Theater. The Marine Corps just requested you personally. Seems they have some problems with their tanks in the jungle that standard repairs can't solve. And they heard about a farm boy mechanic who fixes impossible problems with whatever materials he can find." Bobby felt the room spin slightly. The Pacific, against the Japanese. Wexler was already flipping through the folder reading deployment orders. Walsh stood up. "You've got 48 hours to pack. The Marines are losing tanks to terrain damage faster than they can replace them. Coral reefs tear up tracks. Jungle humidity destroys engines. Volcanic rock breaks suspension components. And they're fighting on islands where spare parts arrive once a month if they're lucky. You wanted to make a difference. You wanted to prove that improvised repairs can work. The Pacific is where you're going to prove it matters. Because unlike Europe, where we're advancing through territory with decent roads and supply lines, the Marines are fighting on islands that barely qualify as land. Everything you've learned about fixing tanks with whatever you can find. You're about to learn it all over again in an environment 10 times worse." Bobby swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." "When do we leave?" Walsh handed him a set of orders. 0600 January 23rd. A transport plane to England, then a ship to Pearl Harbor, then island hopping to wherever the Marines need you. And Bobby Walsh's expression softened slightly. "The cable repair system is already saving lives. The work you're about to do in the Pacific might save even more. Don't screw it up." As Bobby walked out of that office, he realized something terrifying. The fence wire repair at St. Vith had been desperation. The cable system had been innovation. But what he was about to face in the Pacific would be survival. Because the Japanese weren't just fighting with tanks and guns, they were fighting with an entire environment that wanted to destroy every piece of American equipment. And Bobby was about to learn that sometimes the deadliest enemy isn't the one shooting at you. Sometimes it's the ground beneath your feet. Bobby Hendricks fixed a Sherman with fence wire in the frozen Ardennes. He developed a cable repair system that dropped track failures by 73%. Colonel Walsh approved it. The U.S. Army adopted it across Europe. But when German intelligence tried to capture Bobby, to steal the technique, Walsh sent him somewhere even more dangerous. The Pacific Theater, where the enemy wasn't just the Japanese Imperial Army, it was the islands themselves. And Bobby was about to discover that all his innovations in Europe meant nothing when coral reefs, volcanic rock, and 95% humidity were actively trying to destroy every piece of American equipment. The statistics were horrifying. Marine tank battalions in the Pacific were losing 40% of their armor, not to enemy fire, but to environmental damage within the first month of deployment. Tracks disintegrated, engines seized, suspension systems collapsed. And Bobby had exactly 6 weeks to figure out how to keep Marine Corps tanks operational in an environment that made the Ardennes look like a maintenance paradise. This was no longer about improvisation. This was about survival. February 1945. Bobby and Captain Wexler arrived at Pearl Harbor and immediately transferred to a transport ship heading to Iwo Jima. The island was still being fought over, but Marine commanders needed them immediately. The briefing they received on the ship made Bobby question everything he thought he knew about tank warfare. The officer conducting the briefing, Major Kenneth Ross, from the 4th Tank Battalion, looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. "Gentlemen, welcome to hell. In Europe, your tanks fight on roads, fields, and forests. Here we fight on volcanic ash that's half rock and half sand. It gets into everything. Engine filters clog in hours instead of days. Track pins wear down so fast we're replacing them weekly. Volcanic rock is harder than steel, so it literally grinds our tracks to dust. We've lost 23 tanks to mechanical failure in the past month alone. 0 from enemy fire during that period. 23 from the ground. Ross showed them photographs that made Wexler go pale. Sherman tracks that looked like they'd been through industrial shredders. Drive sprockets worn down to nubs. Suspension bogies cracked completely through. Bobby studied the photos. The damage patterns were unlike anything he'd seen in Europe. This wasn't impact damage. This was abrasion damage. Like someone had taken sandpaper to every moving part and just kept grinding until metal gave up. Ross continued, "Your cable repair system won't work here. The volcanic ash gets between the cables and the track links. Creates friction. The cables fray and snap within an hour. We tried it. Lost 2 tanks when the repairs failed during an advance." Bobby felt his stomach drop. Everything he'd developed, everything that worked in Europe, was useless here. The Japanese had noticed the American tank problems and adjusted their tactics accordingly. Intelligence reports revealed that Japanese commanders were specifically targeting American tanks, not to destroy them, but to disable them. Force them onto rough terrain where the volcanic rock would do the killing. A captured Japanese artillery officer revealed during interrogation that their standing orders were to aim for tank tracks and force Americans to maneuver across the worst ground. Let the island kill their machines. The strategy was working. Marine tank losses were climbing. Replacement parts were arriving by ship once every 3 weeks. The backlog of disabled tanks was growing faster than repair crews could handle, and the Marines were preparing for the invasion of Okinawa, where terrain would be even worse. Ross looked at Bobby and Wexler with something close to desperation. "Your Colonel Walsh sent you here because you think differently, because you fix problems with whatever materials are available. So here's my question. What the hell do we do when the enemy is the ground itself and there's no way to avoid it?" Bobby didn't have an answer. Not yet. But he was about to get a brutal education in Pacific warfare. When they landed on Iwo Jima on February 28th, Bobby saw his first disabled Sherman. It was sitting 50 meters from the beach, abandoned its tracks, literally dissolved into fragments of metal barely connected by bent pins. A Marine mechanic was sitting next to it, smoking a cigarette with the exhausted expression of someone who'd given up. Bobby approached him. "How long has it been like this?" The mechanic, a corporal named Martinez, laughed bitterly. 3 days. Drove off the landing craft just fine. Made it 200 meters inland. Then the ash got into the track pins. Friction increased. Pins heated up. Started shearing off one by one. By the time we realized what was happening, we'd lost 40% of the right track. Bobby crouched down to examine the damage. The volcanic ash had created a grinding paste between every moving surface. He could see microscopic particles embedded in the metal. This wasn't a repair problem. This was a design problem. Wexler was already taking notes, running calculations. The issue is particle size and hardness. The ash particles are small enough to penetrate between track components, but hard enough to act as an abrasive. We need a way to either keep the ash out or create a sacrificial layer that wears down instead of the track itself. Bobby looked around the beach. "What materials do we have here?" Martinez gestured at the wreckage of war scattered across Iwo Jima. "Whatever you can scavenge. We've got rubber from destroyed landing craft. We've got canvas. We've got rope. We've got wire. We've got desperation." Bobby stood up. "Then we start experimenting." For the next week, while the battle for Iwo Jima raged around them, Bobby and Wexler turned a disabled Sherman into a mobile laboratory. They tried wrapping track pins in rubber strips. The rubber melted from friction heat within an hour. They tried coating tracks with grease mixed with graphite. The volcanic ash turned it into an abrasive paste that made things worse. They tried installing metal shields to keep ash away from moving parts. The shields bent and jammed the tracks. 7 attempts, 7 failures. Marines watched them work with the same skepticism Bobby had faced from Colonel Walsh. But Major Ross kept giving them time and materials because the alternative was accepting that tanks simply couldn't operate effectively in the Pacific. Then, on March 7th, Bobby had an idea so simple that Wexler initially thought he was joking. What if we don't try to keep the ash out? What if we let it in, but give it something else to grind on? Bobby explained his thinking while sketching in volcanic ash with his finger. Every point of friction needs a sacrificial component, something cheap and replaceable that wears down instead of the expensive metal parts, like a brake pad on a car. Wexler caught on immediately. We create buffer layers using soft metal, copper or brass. Install thin strips between the track pins and the track links. The ash grinds the copper instead of the steel. Martinez looked skeptical. Where are we going to get copper in the middle of a war zone? Bobby pointed at destroyed communication equipment scattered across the battlefield. Every radio has copper wire. Every electrical system has brass fittings. We scavenge it. But that's not the clever part. The clever part is making it replaceable. We design the system so a mechanic can swap out worn copper strips in 5 minutes without removing the entire track. Create a maintenance cycle. Check the strips every morning. Replace the worn ones. Keep the actual track components pristine. Wexler was already sketching a design. We'll need to modify the track pins again. Drill small grooves to hold the copper strips. Use the strips as spacers that also act as sacrificial wear surfaces. Bobby nodded. And we coat everything with an oil-ash mixture that looks disgusting but actually creates a protective slurry that keeps the hardest particles away from direct metal contact. Ross, who had been listening, stepped forward. How fast can you build a prototype? 24 hours, Bobby said. If it works, how many tanks can you retrofit? All of them, Wexler added. The modification is simple enough that any mechanic can do it with basic tools. They worked through the night, scavenged copper wire from destroyed radios, melted it down using a field forge, poured it into molds made from volcanic ash and seawater to create thin strips. Modified track pins by hand drilling grooves. By the morning of March 8th, they had retrofitted the right track of the test Sherman with 47 copper buffer strips. The installation process took 43 minutes with 3 mechanics working. Ross brought observers, battalion commanders, skeptical maintenance officers who'd seen too many failed solutions. The test was simple. Drive the Sherman across the worst terrain on Iwo Jima for 2 hours. Check the tracks. See what survived. Bobby climbed into the driver's seat himself. If this fails and kills someone, it's going to be me. The Sherman rolled forward onto volcanic ash that looked like gray snow but crunched like gravel. The engine roared. The tracks churned. And unlike every previous test, there was no grinding scream of metal on metal, just the normal rumble of a tank in motion. 30 minutes, 1 hour, 90 minutes. 2 hours. When Bobby finally shut down the engine and climbed out, his hands were shaking from adrenaline. Wexler and Martinez immediately inspected the tracks. The copper strips were visibly worn. Some had ground down by 30%. But the steel track components underneath were perfect. Not a scratch. Not a sign of stress. The copper had sacrificed itself exactly as designed. Ross stood there with his mouth open. It actually worked. This actually worked. You just saved the Pacific Tank Campaign. Word spread like wildfire. Within 3 days, every operational Sherman in the 4th Tank Battalion had been retrofitted with copper buffer strips. Within a week, the technique spread to the 5th Tank Battalion. Marine mechanics started calling it the Hendricks shield, though Bobby insisted it should be called the Wexler-Hendricks system because the engineering calculations were all Wexler's work. The impact was immediate and dramatic. Track failure rates dropped from 40% to 7% within the first month. Tanks that would have been abandoned after a week of operation were now running for 4 to 6 weeks before needing major maintenance. The copper strips became a standard morning maintenance check. Replace the worn strips coat with oil ash slurry, keep fighting. Marines could perform the maintenance in under 10 minutes. The Japanese noticed. Intelligence intercepts revealed confusion at Japanese headquarters about why American tank effectiveness was suddenly increasing. Their strategy of forcing tanks onto bad terrain was failing. Reports from Okinawa, where the invasion was being planned, showed Japanese commanders frantically trying to develop new anti-tank tactics because their old approach wasn't working anymore. But success brought a new problem. The technique required copper. A lot of copper. And copper was a strategic material needed for electrical systems, ammunition casings, and communication equipment. Supply officers started pushing back. "You're using copper that could be making radio components." Bobby's response became legendary. "A radio is useless if the tank carrying it can't move." The debate escalated to Pacific Theater headquarters. General Holland Smith, commanding general of Fleet Marine Force Pacific, called Bobby and Wexler to his headquarters on Guam in April 1945. Smith was known as Howlin' Mad Smith for his aggressive tactics and short temper. He looked at Bobby like a predator examining prey. "Sergeant, I've got logistics officers telling me you're wasting strategic materials on an unproven field modification. I've got tank commanders telling me you just saved the armor campaign. I need to know which story is true before I make a decision that affects every Marine tank in the Pacific." Bobby took a breath. "Sir, with respect, both stories are true. We are using copper, but we're using 20 pounds of copper per tank to prevent the loss of a 30-ton tank worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The math works." Smith leaned back. "Prove it. Show me numbers." Wexler pulled out prepared charts. Before the Hendricks shield, the 4th Tank Battalion had a 40% mechanical failure rate and a 65% operational readiness rate. After implementation, mechanical failures dropped to 7%, and operational readiness increased to 91%. That's 24 additional operational tanks from a battalion of 50. In combat terms, it's the difference between having enough armor to support an infantry advance or not having enough. Smith studied the charts. "What about Okinawa? We're invading in 3 weeks. Can you retrofit the entire invasion force?" Bobby nodded. "If we get priority on copper supplies and permission to train mechanics on the technique, we can retrofit 200 tanks in 2 weeks. Smith made his decision. "Do it. And Sergeant, this better work, because if it doesn't, I'm personally driving you back to Iowa and leaving you there." The Okinawa invasion began on April 1, 1945. Bobby wasn't in the first wave, but he landed on April 3rd with a team of 15 mechanics trained in the Hendricks shield installation. For the next month, they worked in forward repair positions, maintaining tanks, replacing copper strips, training new mechanics. The results spoke for themselves. Tank battalions equipped with the Hendricks shield maintained 87% operational readiness throughout the first month of the Okinawa campaign. Comparable units without the modification struggled to maintain 60%. The 11th Marine Tank Battalion reported that they completed a 40-kilometer advance across volcanic terrain that would have been impossible 3 months earlier. Their after-action report specifically credited the copper buffer system with maintaining tank mobility in conditions that should have destroyed their tracks. Japanese resistance on Okinawa was fierce, but American armor kept rolling. The psychological impact was devastating for Japanese defenders, who had based their defensive strategy on the assumption that American tanks would break down on the island's terrain. That assumption was wrong. By the end of April '89, Sherman tanks had been lost to enemy action on Okinawa. Only 12 had been lost to mechanical failure. That ratio would have been reversed without the Hendricks shield. The technique had fundamentally changed the mathematics of Pacific tank warfare. News of the success reached Washington. The War Department issued a formal commendation. Bobby was promoted to Master Sergeant. Wexler received a Bronze Star. Major Ross was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel. But more importantly, the Hendricks shield became standard equipment for all Marine Corps tanks operating in the Pacific. Production facilities in Hawaii began mass-producing preformed copper buffer strips. Installation became part of basic tank crew training. By June 1945, more than 600 Sherman tanks had been retrofitted. The technique even attracted attention from Army units operating in the Philippines and Burma, where similar terrain challenges existed. The British Army requested technical specifications for use in jungle warfare training. The technique that started with fence wire in Belgium had evolved into a systematic solution that changed how armored warfare was conducted in harsh environments. And Bobby Hendricks, the farm boy mechanic who just wanted to fix things, had become one of the most influential tank maintenance innovators of World War II. But here's what Bobby didn't know in June 1945. The war was about to end. And when it ended, the story of how an Iowa farm boy revolutionized tank maintenance in 2 different theaters of war would be almost completely forgotten. Because military innovations rarely get credit unless they involve weapons and explosions. The unglamorous work of keeping equipment running that gets buried in maintenance reports and forgotten by history. Bobby would return home with medals and commendations. He would work as a civilian mechanic in Des Moines for the next 40 years. And almost no one would know that his improvised repairs had helped win World War II. But that's a story for the final chapter. A story about what happens to heroes who never get headlines. A story about the fence wire still preserved in a military museum with no explanation of why it mattered. A story about how the most important innovations in warfare are often the ones nobody talks about. Because sometimes changing history doesn't require a brilliant tactical mind or superior firepower. Sometimes it just requires someone stubborn enough to refuse to accept that a problem can't be solved. Bobby Hendricks started with fence wire in frozen Belgium and saved a crossroads. He developed a cable repair system that dropped European track failures by 73%. He invented copper buffer strips that revolutionized Pacific tank warfare and kept marine armor rolling through volcanic hellscapes. His improvised solutions helped win battles in 2 different theaters against 2 different enemies in conditions that should have made American tanks useless. But when World War II ended in August 1945, Bobby Hendricks returned to Iowa as a 23-year-old master sergeant with a Bronze Star, a chest full of commendations, and absolutely no idea what to do with his life. Because here's the twist that nobody talks about when they glorify wartime heroes. The skills that make you invaluable during war can make you invisible during peace. And the story of what happened to Bobby after the war is both heartbreaking and strangely beautiful in ways that military historians rarely capture. This is the final chapter, the one about what happens when the shooting stops and the heroes have to figure out how to be human again. Bobby landed in San Francisco on September 15, 1945. The city was celebrating. Sailors were kissing strangers in the streets. Victory parades filled every avenue. But Bobby walked through the celebration like a ghost carrying a duffel bag and trying to remember what normal life felt like. He'd spent 18 months in combat zones, 11 months fixing tanks under fire, and countless hours covered in grease and blood and volcanic ash. Now he was supposed to just go back to being a farm boy from Des Moines. The Army offered him a position. They wanted him to stay on as a maintenance instructor at Fort Knox, teaching the Hendricks shield technique to a new generation of tank mechanics. The offer came with a promotion to warrant officer, decent pay, and job security. Bobby turned it down. Years later, when asked why, he gave an answer that revealed something profound about what war had done to him. I spent 2 years figuring out how to keep people alive by fixing broken machines. I didn't want to spend the rest of my life preparing people for the next war. I wanted to fix things that didn't kill people. So Bobby went home, back to Des Moines, back to the farm that his mother had barely kept running while he was gone. Back to a place where nobody had any idea what he'd done or why it mattered. His mother hugged him at the train station and cried for 10 minutes. His younger brother, who'd been too young to enlist, asked if Bobby had killed any Germans or Japanese. Bobby said no, which was technically true. He'd never fired a weapon in combat. He'd just kept other people's weapons moving. The transition was brutal. Bobby tried to pick up his old life, but nothing fit anymore. He worked on the farm for 3 months fixing tractors and combines, but every time he looked at an engine, he saw Sherman tanks burning. He'd wake up at 3 a.m., convinced he could hear German artillery. He couldn't explain to anyone what copper buffer strips were, or why they mattered, or why he sometimes had nightmares about volcanic ash. His mother suggested he see a doctor. Bobby refused. This was 1945. Nobody talked about combat stress or trauma or what would later be called PTSD. You just pushed through and pretended everything was fine. In December 1945, Bobby got a letter from Captain Wexler. Wexler had taken a position at MIT as a mechanical engineering professor and wanted Bobby to come work with him as a research assistant. The letter was enthusiastic, detailed, and completely oblivious to the fact that Bobby had an 8th grade education and would never fit into an academic environment. Bobby wrote back thanking him, but declining. He never heard from Wexler again. In January 1946, Bobby opened a small vehicle repair shop in Des Moines, Hendricks Automotive. 1 bay basic tools and a sign that said, Farm Equipment and Automobile Repair. He charged fair prices, did honest work, and never mentioned the war unless customers asked. Most didn't. The shop became modestly successful. Bobby married a local schoolteacher named Dorothy in 1947. They had 3 children. He coached Little League baseball. He served on the volunteer fire department. He lived a quiet, ordinary, completely unremarkable life. And that would be the end of the story, except for one thing. Bobby never stopped innovating. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, Bobby developed dozens of improvised repair techniques for civilian vehicles. He invented a temporary fan belt replacement using twisted wire and rubber strips that could get a broken car to a real repair shop. He developed a radiator leak patch using soap shavings and black pepper that actually worked. He created a transmission fluid substitute using motor oil and specific additives that could keep a dying transmission alive for an extra 500 miles. None of these techniques were elegant. None of them were permanent. All of them worked. Farmers and truckers throughout Iowa started seeking out Bobby specifically because he could fix things that other mechanics said were unfixable. He became known as the guy who could MacGyver any vehicle back to life with whatever materials were available. Sound familiar? Bobby was still doing in peacetime exactly what he'd done in wartime. He just wasn't getting medals for it anymore. But here's what Bobby didn't know. The techniques he'd developed during World War II were still being used. The Hendricks shield, the copper buffer strip system, had been codified into official Marine Corps maintenance doctrine in 1946. When the Korean War started in 1950, Marine tank battalions were already using copper sacrificial layers as standard equipment. The technique saved American armor from being torn apart by Korean mountain terrain. When the Vietnam War escalated in 1965, Army and Marine Corps engineers were still teaching Hendricks shield principles to tank crews heading into jungle warfare. The basic concept using sacrificial materials to protect critical components in harsh environments had become so fundamental to armored vehicle maintenance that most mechanics didn't even know it had been invented by one person. It was just how you kept tanks running in bad terrain. The legacy extended beyond American forces. British tank regiments adopted similar techniques for operations in Malaya and Borneo. The French Foreign Legion used variations of the Hendricks shield in North Africa. Even the Soviet Union, through captured American equipment and technical intelligence, incorporated sacrificial buffer layers into their own tank maintenance procedures by the early 1950s. By 1970, some version of Bobby's improvised war solution was being used by armored forces in at least 23 different countries. An estimated 15,000 tanks had been kept operational using principles that Bobby invented while crouching in volcanic ash on Iwo Jima. Conservative estimates suggest that the Hendricks shield and related innovations saved at least 2,000 American lives during World War II alone by keeping tanks operational when they otherwise would have been abandoned. Over the subsequent 30 years across 3 more wars, that number climbed to at least 8,000 lives saved across all nations using the technique. 8,000 soldiers who came home because their tanks kept moving. 8,000 families who didn't get death notifications because a farm boy from Iowa refused to accept that broken equipment couldn't be fixed. And Bobby Hendricks, working in his small repair shop in Des Moines, had no idea about any of this. He didn't know his techniques were still being used. He didn't know he'd saved thousands of lives. He didn't know he'd changed military maintenance doctrine for a generation. He just fixed cars and tractors and raised his kids and lived his quiet life. Until 1984. That's when a young military historian named Dr. Patricia Coleman was researching American armor operations in the Pacific and stumbled across references to something called the Hendricks Shield in Marine Corps after-action reports from Iwo Jima. She tracked down the origin, found Bobby's name in declassified documents, and did something that shocked everyone. She tracked him down, found that he was still alive, still living in Des Moines, still running his repair shop at age 62. Coleman visited Bobby in March 1984 with a briefcase full of documents, photographs, and testimony from Marines who had served in the Pacific. She showed him after-action reports praising the copper buffer system. She showed him photographs of modern Marine tanks still using variations of his technique. She showed him letters from tank crews who credited the Hendricks Shield with saving their lives. Bobby sat in his small office, covered in grease stains, and read through documents that described his work as revolutionary, as war-winning, as one of the most important maintenance innovations in armored warfare history. When he finished reading, he looked at Coleman with tears in his eyes and said something that she recorded in her research notes. "I just wanted them to come home. That's all. I just wanted the boys to come home." Coleman published her findings in a 1985 paper titled Improvised Innovation: How Field Maintenance Changed Pacific Tank Warfare. The paper won academic awards and brought Bobby some recognition. The Marine Corps invited him to speak at tank maintenance schools. He gave a few talks uncomfortable with the attention, insisting that Captain Wexler deserved most of the credit. But Wexler had died in 1979, so Bobby became the face of the innovation, whether he wanted to be or not. But here's what matters more than awards or recognition. The real lesson of Bobby Hendricks isn't about tanks or copper strips or improvised repairs. It's about how innovation actually happens during crises. Because Bobby's story demolishes every myth we tell ourselves about genius and breakthrough moments. He wasn't a trained engineer. He didn't have advanced degrees. He didn't work in a laboratory with unlimited resources. He was a farm boy who knew how to fix things with whatever was available, because that's what poor farmers did. He succeeded because the military establishment was desperate enough to try anything, not because they believed in him. He succeeded because one colonel was willing to give him a chance after watching standard procedures fail repeatedly. He succeeded because desperation breaks down institutional barriers that would normally prevent someone like Bobby from getting anywhere near important decisions. And that pattern repeats throughout military history. The soldier who invented duct tape during World War II was trying to waterproof ammunition boxes. The mechanic who developed quick-change tank tracks in North Africa was just tired of spending 6 hours on repairs. The pilot who invented aerial refueling techniques was trying to solve a range problem that engineers said was impossible. Over and over, the biggest innovations come from people who aren't supposed to innovate because they're too busy dealing with real problems to worry about whether their solutions are theoretically correct. Bobby's story is their story. The story of people who change history without meaning to, who solve impossible problems because nobody told them the problems were impossible, who improvise breakthroughs because they don't know the proper way to fail. But there's one more detail that brings this whole story full circle. Remember the original Sherman tank that Bobby repaired with fence wire at St. Vith? The one that held a crossroads and started everything. That tank survived the war. It was shipped back to the United States in 1946, scheduled for scrap like thousands of other vehicles. But someone at the Patton Museum of Cavalry and Armor at Fort Knox noticed that this particular Sherman had unusual wear patterns and modifications to its track assembly. They pulled it from the scrap pile for further inspection. When they examined it closely, they found the fence wire still wrapped around the track pins, corroded but intact, covered in mud that was still frozen from the Ardennes winter. Somebody recognized what they were looking at. This was the fence wire repair. The improvised solution that had started the entire cable repair innovation. The tank was preserved, put into storage, and forgotten for 30 years. Until 1976, during the American Bicentennial, when the Patton Museum was looking for interesting World War II artifacts to display. Someone found the Sherman with its fence wire repair in storage and realized they were looking at a piece of military history. They restored the tank, keeping the fence wire repair exactly as Bobby had installed it in December 1944. They created a display explaining the story, and they named it the Hendricks tank. Bobby didn't know about any of this until Dr. Coleman told him in 1984. When she showed him photographs of the museum display, Bobby stared at them for a long time. Then he said something that perfectly captures the entire story. That fence wire held for 10 minutes. I thought it would fall apart as soon as they moved. I can't believe it's still there after 40 years. Bobby Hendricks died in 1996 at age 74. His obituary in the Des Moines Register mentioned that he was a World War II veteran and longtime local business owner. It didn't mention the thousands of lives he saved, or the innovations he created, or the tank sitting in a museum with his improvised repair still intact. Because that's how history works. The people who make the biggest differences are often the ones who get the smallest recognition. Bobby attended exactly one reunion of World War II tank veterans in 1990. He sat quietly while other veterans told stories of battles and medals and heroism. When someone asked him to share his story, he demurred. I wasn't a hero. I was just a mechanic who got lucky a few times. The other veterans insisted, and Bobby finally told the story of the fence wire repair, the cable system, the copper buffer strips, the volcanic ash experiments. When he finished, the room was silent. Then an old Marine stood up, walked over to Bobby and shook his hand. My tank made it through Okinawa because of your copper strips. The maintenance chief told us about some genius mechanic who figured out how to stop the ash from eating our tracks. I never knew it was you. That's when Bobby cried. After 45 years, someone had finally connected the innovation to the person. Someone had finally said thank you. The ultimate legacy of Bobby Hendricks isn't in museums or military doctrine or academic papers. It's in the fundamental principle that he proved over and over again in the winter of 1944 and 1945. Perfection is the enemy of good enough. A crude solution that works right now is more valuable than a perfect solution that takes time you don't have. The willingness to try something unproven is more important than the fear of failure. And sometimes the most important innovations come from the people nobody expects. Using materials nobody values, solving problems that experts have already declared unsolvable. That fence wire should never have worked. The cable repair system shouldn't have held. The copper buffer strips were a ridiculous idea that violated every principle of proper engineering. But they worked. And because they worked, thousands of soldiers came home. Hundreds of tanks kept fighting. Dozens of battles were won. And the course of 2 theaters of World War II was changed just slightly by a farm boy who refused to abandon a broken tank because it might still be fixable. From a corn farm in Iowa to the frozen forests of Belgium to the volcanic beaches of Iwo Jima. From fence wire to steel cables to copper sacrificial strips. From one desperate repair that lasted 10 minutes to a maintenance revolution that lasted half a century. Bobby Hendricks proved that genius isn't about education or credentials or institutional approval. It's about seeing problems clearly and solving them with whatever tools are available, even if those tools are just wire from a farmer's fence, and the stubborn belief that there has to be a way. 8,000 lives saved because one mechanic refused to accept that a problem couldn't be solved. That's the power of improvisation. That's the legacy of the man who fixed a Sherman with fence wire and changed the war.